It was a busy afternoon in the heart of Los Angeles, the luxury store alive with the hum of elegant shoppers gliding through aisles of pristine displays. The polished floors reflected the soft overhead lights, and the scent of high-end perfumes mixed with the quiet chatter of customers browsing the latest collections. The store was a world unto itself, untouched by the chaos outside. The doorbell chimed as the entrance swung open, and in walked Barron Trump, his tall figure standing out amongst the others. His expression was calm, his steps deliberate, yet there was something undeniably magnetic about his presence. As he moved further into the store, the bustling atmosphere around him seemed to shift. Conversations paused. Eyes lingered. He wasn't just another shopper. He was Barron Trump, the son of the former president. From behind the counter, the store manager, David, froze for a split second. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized the young man immediately. 1,000 thoughts rushed through his mind. The staff was trained to treat every customer equally, but he knew the rules had a dark undercurrent. The company had strict orders not to show favoritism, and that included treating high-profile clients with the same indifference as anyone else. But this situation felt different. David's palms were clammy as he took a deep breath, willing himself to remain composed. His eyes nervously darted from Barron to the other employees, who were quietly watching. He could sense their unease, the shared tension in the air. How could he do this? How could he follow the rules without feeling like he was making a mistake? He glanced at the door again, wondering if someone else would step in to handle it. But no one did. He hesitated for just a moment too long, and then, with a knot in his throat, he walked toward Barron. His heart was racing, but he kept his voice steady, almost too steady. "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm afraid I can't allow you to shop here today. There's been an issue with our policies, and—" Barron's face didn't change. He stood there, his posture still and unbothered, yet his eyes, a calm sea of blue, held a quiet understanding. David's words hung in the air, stilted and uncomfortable. Barron's gaze softened ever so slightly, but the hurt was undeniable. It wasn't the anger David expected. It was something deeper, a kind of quiet disappointment that seemed to settle around them like a heavy fog. David's breath caught in his throat as Barron replied softly, "I didn't expect this." The words cut through the manager, deeper than any sharp retort could. It wasn't just a denial of service. It was a quiet dismissal of the respect every customer deserved. Barron's calmness left David feeling more exposed, like he was the one who had failed in the exchange. The store, which had been buzzing with noise only moments ago, now felt eerily silent. The weight of the moment settled on David's shoulders. It wasn't just about Barron being a public figure. It was about the undeniable unfairness of the situation. And David, for all his attempts to hold on to his professionalism, realized something that would stay with him long after the moment passed. Sometimes rules weren't enough. Sometimes doing the right thing was harder than following orders. David stood there, his heart pounding in his chest, as Barron's calm gaze remained fixed on him. The words he had just spoken to the young Trump felt like a cruel weight in his mind, each syllable heavier than the last. The silence in the store felt deafening, and yet it wasn't the quiet that unsettled David. It was the look on Barron's face. The young man didn't seem angry or upset. Instead, there was a quiet disappointment, a subtle sadness that resonated deeply with David. It was the kind of hurt that spoke volumes without a single word. David could feel the eyes of the staff on him, but he dared not look around. His gaze remained fixed on Barron, who hadn't moved since the moment the words of denial had left David's lips. The weight of the situation pressed on his chest, suffocating him, and yet his body remained frozen. A part of him screamed for Barron to leave, to avoid the tension, but there was another part that wished the young man would fight back, show some emotion, anything to justify the decision he had just made. The uncomfortable stillness was broken only by the soft rustle of clothing, the shuffle of shoes on the floor, and David's own breath. He knew he was losing control of the situation, but worse than that, he knew he was losing control of himself. Every part of him wanted to apologize, to fix what he had just broken. But the unspoken fear of repercussions, the fear of losing his job or facing judgment from his superiors, held him in place. David's mind raced, torn between his professional duty and the profound sense of wrong that washed over him. How could he have done this? How could he have followed orders when he knew deep down that they were unjust? Barron was no different from any other customer. He didn't deserve to be treated like this, especially not by David, who was supposed to be the one to offer respect and service. And yet, there he was, standing in front of Barron, a man who had done nothing wrong, denying him something as basic as respect. He looked around the store, the eyes of his employees now turned toward him, and he could sense the silent judgment from every corner. He had broken something that could never be repaired with just a simple apology. He had crossed a line, and worse, he had done it to a young man who likely already faced more than his fair share of scrutiny. Barron's quiet composure, his lack of anger, only made David's inner turmoil worse. He wasn't sure whether to feel ashamed for the way he had acted, or grateful that Barron hadn't raised a scene. But as the seconds dragged on, David's guilt became unbearable. Barron wasn't a figurehead. He wasn't just the son of someone famous. He was a person, just like everyone else in that room. And David had failed to see that. Barron's eyes softened, and he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "It's okay," Barron said quietly, as though he was trying to make it easier for David, for himself. But David felt the sting of those words. They weren't just a sign of acceptance. They were a reminder that he had failed to do what was right. The silence that followed was thick, and David knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, as the moment seemed to freeze in time. David stood before Barron, the weight of his decision hanging between them. He had expected anger, frustration, even outrage, but instead there was only stillness. Barron's expression remained calm, his eyes steady, but not unkind. It was as if he was quietly taking everything in, processing the situation with a maturity far beyond his years. David's stomach churned with guilt, his mind racing to fill the void left by the silence. He had thought that following the rules would make things easier, but it hadn't. Instead, it had opened up a chasm of discomfort and regret. He looked at Barron, wondering how he could stand there so composed, how he could bear the weight of this moment with such quiet grace. For a heartbeat, David almost wished Barron would get angry, shout, or demand to speak with someone in charge. At least then, he could justify his actions. But Barron did none of that. He stood still, his posture relaxed, his eyes never leaving David's. The young man's calmness was a sharp contrast to the storm David was feeling inside. Finally, Barron broke the silence. His voice was low, measured, but it carried a weight that David wasn't prepared for. "I understand," Barron said softly, "but no one should ever be treated differently. Everyone deserves respect, no matter who they are." The simplicity of his words cut through the air like a quiet thunderclap. Barron's tone wasn't accusatory, nor was it filled with the bitterness David had expected. It was a quiet truth, spoken without malice, but with the kind of clarity that demanded to be heard. David's chest tightened as Barron's words sank in. He had denied this young man, a child of wealth and privilege, access to a basic human right, respect. And yet Barron, with nothing but calm strength, was reminding him that respect was universal. Barron wasn't asking for special treatment. He wasn't demanding anything other than to be treated like everyone else. And that, somehow, made the situation even more difficult to bear. David swallowed hard, feeling the sting of Barron's quiet wisdom. There was no anger in Barron's voice, no resentment, only a gentle but firm reminder of what mattered most. It wasn't about the rules. It wasn't about status or fame. It was about human dignity, and in that moment, Barron was the one teaching David the lesson. As the words settled in the air, David realized just how small his earlier actions seemed. The power in Barron's words wasn't in their volume, but in their quiet, unwavering truth. And for the first time, David felt the full weight of what he had done, how easily he had let fear and insecurity cloud his judgment. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. The young man who had every reason to demand special treatment was the one showing the most grace. Barron's gaze softened and he gave a small nod, as though to signal that he was ready to move on. There was no need for further confrontation. Barron had risen above it all, and in doing so, he had shown David exactly what it meant to lead with compassion. David stood there, frozen, as Barron's figure disappeared through the store's glass doors. The quiet hum of the store filled the silence that had followed Barron's departure. His mind was a whirlwind, the reality of what had just happened slowly sinking in. For the first time in years, he questioned everything he thought he knew about professionalism, respect, and doing the right thing. He had followed the rules. He had acted according to the store's policies. But deep down, David knew he had made a grave mistake. Barron hadn't been angry, hadn't raised his voice or demanded special treatment. He had simply walked away, leaving David to face the consequences of his actions. The weight of Barron's unspoken disappointment pressed on his chest, a feeling far worse than any reprimand from his boss. The young man's grace in the face of humiliation was a stark contrast to David's own internal chaos. The fact that Barron had accepted the situation without protest made David feel even smaller, as if he had failed not only professionally, but personally. He leaned against the counter, trying to steady himself, but the image of Barron's calm face wouldn't leave his mind. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how wrong he had been. It wasn't just about following company rules. It was about treating people with basic human decency, respect that wasn't based on status or power. Barron hadn't demanded anything from him, yet David had denied him something so fundamental. He felt a sting of guilt that wouldn't fade, no matter how much he tried to justify his actions. David had been so focused on his fear of breaking company protocol that he had lost sight of what truly mattered. Barron hadn't come in looking for special treatment. He had simply come in to shop like any other customer. And yet David had made him feel less than that, just because of his name, his family, his public life. The realization hit him hard. This wasn't just about a mistake in the moment. It was about how easily he had let his own insecurities and biases shape his decisions. A deep sense of shame settled in his gut. He had always prided himself on being a professional, on following the rules to the letter. But in that moment, he realized that sometimes the rules weren't enough. Sometimes, doing what was right meant stepping beyond the confines of policy, beyond the comfort of the familiar, and showing basic kindness and respect to every person who walked through the door. As he stood there, a decision began to form in his mind. He could let this moment pass, dismiss it as an unfortunate encounter, or he could make things right. But making things right meant confronting his fear of failure, of the judgment he might face from his superiors. His loyalty to the company clashed with the growing sense of moral responsibility. David took a deep breath and straightened up. He knew what he had to do. He would speak to the store owner, admit his mistake, and find a way to apologize to Barron. It wasn't going to be easy, but David knew that he couldn't live with the regret of doing nothing. It was time to make things right, not just for Barron, but for himself. His heart raced as he made his way to the back office. His mind made up. He couldn't undo what had happened, but he could take the first step toward redemption. David paced nervously in the back office, his hands trembling as he thought about what he was about to do. He had made the decision to apologize, to admit his mistake and take responsibility for how he had treated Barron. His heart was heavy with regret, but a small part of him felt a flicker of hope. He couldn't undo what had happened, but he could try to make it right. Taking a deep breath, David straightened his jacket, gathering every ounce of courage he had. He knew that an apology wasn't just about saying the words. It was about meaning them, showing the humility he had lacked earlier. He had seen Barron's quiet strength, his ability to rise above the situation, and David couldn't let that moment slip by without doing something to mend the broken trust. David walked toward the front of the store, his heart pounding in his chest. As he approached Barron's family, he caught sight of them standing near the entrance. Barron's parents were speaking softly to each other, unaware of David's approach. His eyes locked on Barron, who stood a few steps behind his parents, his posture still as composed as ever. David's throat tightened as he realized just how deeply Barron had been affected by the incident, despite his quiet grace. "Mr. and Mrs. Trump," David began, his voice a little unsteady but firm. Barron's parents turned to face him, their expressions wary but polite. "I need to apologize for the way I treated your son earlier. The way I handled the situation was wrong, and I am deeply sorry for the disrespect I showed him." The words felt heavier than David had expected, each one leaving his mouth with more weight than the last. He could see Barron's parents exchange a glance, their surprise evident. The apology wasn't what they had expected. It was sincere, raw, and full of humility. Barron's father, a man who had been through his share of public scrutiny, stepped forward, his eyes softened by the genuine remorse in David's tone. "We appreciate your honesty," Mr. Trump said, his voice calm but filled with a subtle gratitude. "It's not easy to admit when you've made a mistake, especially in front of others. That takes courage." David nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He looked over at Barron, who had been quietly observing the exchange. The young man's face was calm, but David could see the subtle shift in his expression. Barron wasn't angry. He wasn't even upset. He was simply accepting the apology with the quiet dignity that had marked his every action in the store. His lack of resentment left David in awe. Barron had every right to feel betrayed, to demand an apology with force, but instead he embraced the moment with maturity far beyond his years. "I was wrong," David continued, his voice thick with reflection. "What I did wasn't just a mistake. It was an opportunity for kindness that I missed. I can't change what happened, but I want you to know that I've learned from this, and I promise, I will do better." Barron's mother nodded, a faint smile playing at the corners of her lips. She didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes spoke volumes. Gratitude, understanding, and an acknowledgement that the apology was more than just words. It was a sign of growth, of David's willingness to evolve. As the conversation drew to a close, David felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The air felt lighter, the tension that had hung in the store now gone. Barron gave him a small nod of acknowledgement, an unspoken understanding that this moment had, in its own way, healed something between them. David watched as Barron and his family left the store, their steps lighter than before, and as he stood there, a sense of peace settled over him. He had made a mistake, but he had learned something far more valuable in the process. That true growth came from taking responsibility, and that the courage to apologize was often the first step toward redemption. As David stood behind the counter, watching Barron and his family walk out of the store, the weight in his chest began to lift. For the first time that day, he felt a sense of peace settle within him. The apology had been difficult to offer, but it had been the right thing to do. And as he observed the way Barron's parents had graciously accepted it, a realization hit him like a gentle wave. This wasn't just about him. This was about the kind of person he wanted to be moving forward. The atmosphere in the store had shifted since the moment of the apology. What had felt like a cold, tension-filled environment now felt warmer, more inviting. The staff members who had witnessed the entire exchange no longer seemed on edge. Instead, they were talking to each other more openly, their movements more fluid. David noticed the change in their demeanor. The unease had faded, replaced by a quiet professionalism, one born from understanding and compassion. It was as though the apology had sparked something in all of them, a realization that kindness wasn't just for special moments. It was the foundation of how they should treat everyone, no matter who they were. David took a deep breath, his eyes sweeping across the store. He had always believed in treating customers well, but something had shifted today. Now, it wasn't just about following procedures or maintaining the appearance of professionalism. It was about genuinely connecting with people, seeing them as more than just shoppers. He had learned that respect wasn't something to be earned. It was something to be freely given. The ripple effect of his own decision to apologize was now reaching the staff, and David knew that the change wasn't just in him. It was in all of them. As the store continued to hum with activity, David couldn't help but think of Barron. The young man's ability to remain calm, composed, and kind in the face of adversity was nothing short of inspiring. Barron had the right to demand more, to make a scene, to voice his anger, but instead he had chosen to act with dignity, teaching David and everyone around him that the true measure of strength wasn't in how we respond to the good moments, but how we rise above the difficult ones. Barron's silent grace had left a profound mark on David, and he realized that the young man had taught him more than he could have imagined. Barron had shown him that no matter how challenging a situation may seem, we always have a choice in how we respond. David now understood that sometimes the greatest impact comes not from grand gestures, but from small, quiet moments of kindness. Moments that, though they may seem insignificant at the time, ripple out to affect everyone around us. As the day drew to a close, David reflected on everything that had happened. The store had witnessed a shift, but so had he. The decisions he made, the way he treated people, these things mattered, not just in the moment, but in the long run. He had made a mistake, but he had also learned how to rise from it. And that, in the end, was the true power of kindness. It had the ability to change everything, one small action at a time. Have you ever experienced a moment where kindness changed everything? Share your story in the comments below. Let's continue to spread compassion and make a difference, one act of kindness at a time.